So today we have a twin turbo Nissan 300ZX completely factory here in the shop, and we're actually about to do a new style fuel injector conversion. So we have some OS 380cc, I believe. If not, it's like 375cc to replace the 370cc OEM square plug connector. Not only are we doing that, we're doing some valve cover gaskets and a few other little odds and ends while we're in here for the customer. So now we're actually about to start tearing into it. So we're not really going to talk around much here. We're just going to cut straight to the video. So first and foremost, when you're removing everything, the first thing that you're going to pull off is your timing cover. And these are actually from factory. They're in by 5mm Allen keys, and a lot of times they're replaced with just 10mm bolts. Now we're going to take a 14mm wrench and we're going to crack both of these loose, the throttle cable and the cruise control. Why did I almost say power steering? So now we're just going to kind of pull them out of the way so they're not in our way. A lot of times it's easier just to pull your cruise control bracket. You got like a 10mm there, maybe one more somewhere that I'm forgetting, and just pull this whole thing out of the way. As for the throttle cable, you'll have this little P clamp over here. Just remove that 10mm. And then you have another one like this on the side that you can remove right here to pull it out of the way. So now that those are out of the way, we're actually going to tackle our balance tube up here. So we've got two 12mm over here, 12mm, 12mm, 12mm. And then we're going to have a spring clamp back here with a hose for our carbon canister. And then we've got our fuel dampener, maybe these assorted lines back here. I'm sure this has to do with the boost controller or something, and I think this has to do with the boost gauge itself. One thing that I like to do as I remove everything, kind of like that P-clamp over here, put your bolt back so you always know where everything goes. I completely forgot to mention your idle air control hose back here. It's got a spring clamp. Move that, and now we should be able to remove our balance tube. So you might have to crack this 10mm loose to get this bracket up, or to allow it to have enough travel to actually pull it off. There we go. Not always though. Oh yeah, definitely need some new balance tube O-rings. Good thing he ordered some. And once you got it all disconnected, you can wiggle it out and push and twist and slide it out of that idle air control. Now we got our balance tube off. Now is a good time that we can go ahead and we can pull all of our coil packs. So that way, or at least our connectors to our wiring harness, so we can pull each of these 12mm and remove our coil packs. Something kind of like that. So we're going to go ahead and do that same thing to all 5 of the other cylinders, and we'll be back. Just like that, we've got them all out. Now it's time to go ahead and focus on our fuel rail, because once we get our fuel rail off and moved out of the way, we can start to tackle our wiring harness and peeling that all back to remove it out of our way. A couple 10mm. I'm replacing the fuel lines, but I'm not wanting to cut them all right now, so I can kind of use them to, you know, guess or figure out which goes where. So now I'm actually going to remove the battery terminal with this one 10mm bolt, so that way we can have everything ready so we can pull our grounds and not have to worry about frying anything with this all still hooked up. Now we're going to grab a Phillips. We're going to start loosening up some of these hose clamps. I'm just going to remove both of these from here to try to pull this all out in one assembly, and especially so I can get it out of the strut bar bracket. Yeah, looks like I only have one choice here. That's crazy because I always do this one. I never do this one over here, but I don't know if that's how Nissan intended it, but that's how we're doing it. Man, they really weren't that friendly here. Okay, I guess we can't get the screw down here. So I like to get the screw or the hose clamp at the very bottom that connects to the fuel rail, so you can pry right here on these ears and pull it off the line. Now, since we're fully unhooked, minus this fuel pressure regulator vacuum source over here, we're actually going to remove all of these and we're just going to pull it out. I'm going to show you guys the removal because you either got to cut it, you got to use hose pliers or like hose disconnects or pliers. Just be resilient and keep at it. So unfortunately we had to cut nearly every single fuel line to actually get this thing out because it was stuck. You do have your hard line here that goes to your fuel pressure regulator. You also have a soft line back here that goes to the beginning of that hard line. Now we get the joy of removing all of the wiring harness. So we have a ground back here. We have a double ground back here by your cylinder 6 coil pack. Here we've got us our 3-wire O2 sensor. And right beside it, you have a 2-wire VTC, and those will be with your grounds and these 4 and 6 injector, not injector, coil packs. You also have this 2-wire plug right here, which is your knock sensor. You obviously have all 6 of your injectors. You're gonna need a pick to get them off. That's at least my recommendation. And this is my favorite pick to do so. So basically we're gonna have a magnet to catch the clip on the back side, and all you're gonna do, poke it in, and you'll twist it out. So as long as you get that point in, you just twist the pick, it'll yank it out. Now our O2 and VTC for this side are actually mounted over here on the side, but we're not going to get to that yet since this is an automatic. It has this automatic harness right here. You'll have a 10 mil to remove that, and you can go ahead and just unplug them and kind of move it out the way. And then you can pull this bracket up after you pull this 10 mil to disconnect those connectors. You'll also want to pull your TPS. You can use a pick or a flathead to get this one. Prongs on it to hold it on, keep it from falling off. And I always recommend to put your clip back on before you take the connector all the way off. That TPS connector is like stuffed. We're gonna wait till we get this idle air control hose off. So let's go ahead and remove all of our injectors, and then we'll try to move on to the back side, so the idle air control and the auxiliary air and whatnot. And once them clips are out, you can just tug on that wire and pull that connector right off. So since we have all of our injectors done, it came to my attention there's a little bit more that we have to pull to get access to our idle air control and stuff back here. This vacuum source right here on this block, this went to your fuel pressure regulator. You can pull that off. Now we have a hose clamp. Why in the world is it on the bottom? I have no idea. But we're gonna move that so we can disconnect the brake booster hose. Hopefully we'll be able to get that old hose off. That was a little tougher than I expected. Now we're gonna grab the same pliers. We're going to move this hose right here, or this hose clamp, so we can pull this off the idle air control. And then we're also going to pull this off the turbo outlet. Now, no doubt in my mind that this one's a little stuck. We're going to try to use a little bit of persuasion. It's connected to the wiring harness. Wow, there's no room on a stock TT. I tell you what, man. So we pretty much just got this little wiring harness out back here, and we did manage to get this. Fortunately, all these clips pretty much broke because they're so brittle. Like, I pressed the push tab down to slide it out and it just snapped and disintegrated. Not much I can do about that. It's kind of an age thing. But this is your fast idle control. Unfortunately, that kind of broke off, but connector's solid. We may have another one to repin and put on, but the clip will still work with one side. So this is the hard to get to one, and I assume that's how that one got beat up a little bit and was so weak to just fall apart. Then you have this yellow one, and this is actually your top connector. So you're going to do the same kind of thing you did here with your pick and finagle that clip out and use your magnet to catch it. I actually think I'm going to wrap up shop here for tonight, so we'll catch you guys in the morning and we'll resume after we have some fully charged batteries and maybe a little bit of sunlight as well, because it's almost midnight. So it's actually been a couple days because, of course, after we just got over 3 weeks of being sick, we've came down with a sinus infection. Yay! But needless to say, we're back out here now, we're feeling good enough, and we sound decent enough. We're not fully congested to where I sound like I'm holding my nose the whole time. So let's tackle back into this and get this Z finished up, because we really need to loosen up these charge pipes so we can get access to the EGR that's back there. It's nearly impossible to reach right now, but we actually did go ahead and unplug this TPS just as soon as we came out here, once we got the AIV out. So we have these two 12 mils that we need to disconnect the bracket from the plenum, so that way the plenum can actually come up. But we have to remove that 10 mil right there to remove the charge pipe, as that helps secure it into place. And get this flex head 1/4 inch drive wrench from Harbor Freight. It's like 10 bucks or something. That allows you to bend this and you only get a couple clicks, but that's all you need to get those bolts out. Also a deep well socket and a short socket I had to use on each side. Only one would work. But to fully loosen the charge pipe, you have to get way back here to get the 8 mil on the coupler. So that's going to be the biggest challenge here, is just to get room to do all this. Once we have all that done, all the wiring harness back here should be fully removed, so it should just be easy peasy after we get those moved and the EGR loosened up. Because then realistically we only have our 8 plenum bolts up here and it should come off. Take that back. we have 4 coolant lines that warm your throttle bodies are actually connected to your turbo coolant lines. So we may be doing a delete on this thing as well. Let's kind of open up this area to give us some more room to, work with. Well, it's probably been a solid 45 minutes now, and we've got pretty much everything disconnected. The EGR bolts are removed, and of course we dropped one on each side. So hopefully gonna have to fish that out with a magnet. If not, we'll just replace it with a new bolt. As if you know, once you drop something in a stock twin turbo bay, kiss it goodbye. I guess I'll give you guys a couple tips. So we had to pull the charge pipe out from over here because there's virtually no room to get to the EGR. So once you get it loosened back here, the best way I found out is to pop it out up top. I was trying to go out this way, but it was getting hung up. Once we bent it up this way, we could twist it and snake it out. And well, unfortunately this was our only casualty, but we'll kind of secure that back on once we're all done. There is also another vacuum line down here, right beside your coolant line that I was speaking of. Got to remove that to get to those EGR bolts. Now we have one PCV valve back here that you can tell this thing has never been touched or worked on from the factory. That's because the hose clamps are not positioned in a way that anyone working on the car would put them. Like this side, it's pointing outwards. The other side is pointing in. So there's virtually no way to get to it. What I'm thinking is when we lift the plenum up, once we loosen it, we may just have to pull it or cut it, replace it, so that way we can reorient the hose clamps to where we can actually install it when it goes back on. So thankfully this is an auto car, so I actually have some room back over here to fit my arm in. If it was a manual with the vacuum assisted clutch booster and all that stuff, no bueno. I have no idea what you would even do. And we also removed another coolant line. There's one right back here. There's a hose clamp right down on that hard pipe, as well as this hard pipe right here. And it's really tough to see, but right here there's literally a line directly below, almost touching the plenum. That's another coolant line that you need to remove that's going to be in the way of pulling this plenum. So now we can officially remove this PCV. Now we actually have to remove all 8 of our plenum bolts. Yes, this is a bolt. And then we should be able to lift our plenum off. Cracking them all loose so we can come back with the impact and zip them out. Ooh, that does not feel the best. Maybe we won't use the impact just in case. Now we're going to lift up on it. And as we lift up, we're actually going to have to kind of push down on these EGRs, because as you lift up, it's so tight that it's going to pull the EGR up, and it will keep you from ever getting your plenum off. So now that we got each of the coolant lines disconnected, there's actually one bracket over here on the side that's keeping everything together. It's a good thing that we're here so we can show you guys and tell you, so you don't have to figure it out like me. We did pull the battery out so we could get access to one of the coolant lines here in the back. Now it's just a matter of popping this EGR port back out, which I like to pry against the valve cover to kind of give us that little bit of clearance. Like that, just popped it right off. There's literally just like one thing somewhere holding this up. Yep, coolant line. All right, let's figure out what it is and we'll report back. So what it was that was holding us up was actually this turbo coolant line comes to the port right behind the PCV valve. So it was pretty much impossible to see, but this is our little EGR hose back here. We had another coolant line right here. There's a little nipple. We had another one right back here, straight off this heater core pipe. Oh yeah, other than the one over there that we showed you about first. Now we're officially on to the whole reason that we're here, and that's to remove this fuel rail and to replace the fuel injectors. Now obviously while we're in here, the owner actually wants us to do valve cover gaskets and all that whole nine, so we're going to do that all off video, but we're here just to show you how to do the fuel injectors. That being said, we're going to remove this ground strap from the fuel rail that actually holds the harness bracket for your knock sensor. We've got 6 bolts here holding the fuel rail down. And you just use this, wiggle, pry it just a little bit, and then lift up. Ta-da! Fuel injectors are removed. Now it's a great time to replace these. As you can tell, these ones are pretty blown out. So now that we got the valve cover gaskets and everything all done and resealed, it's actually time for us to come down here and remove our fuel injectors. So we actually already pulled 2 of them out. So we have 4 to remove and 6 to install, obviously. Sorry about the previous footage when I was really sick. Thankfully we're good now, and I just played back my video to find out where I was. I sound terrible, so sorry. The best way to remove these is to get a 10 mil socket to put on the bottom side. 3/8 drive usually, not an impact socket, kind of a thinner wall, and it's just big enough to fit right here on this lip of the injector. If you do have the stock style caps with these screws, I really recommend using an impact to remove them so it gets a good bite. If not, vice grips are good at getting them out, and if worse comes to worse, you can drill them out and do it that way. When you got to drill the cap off, the threads are always only hand tight in there, unless it's worst case scenario, obviously. Get a good bite and remove. Pull your cap off. Now you're going to flip your rail over, put your 10 mil on. It's really good to kind of do this in a vise or somewhere that you can hold the rail on top of. We're just going to take this mallet and probably give myself another blood blister. Wow, good job, Caden. But just like that, we pop the fuel injector out of the rail. That actually came out very easily, I will admit. They don't always just pop out like that. So let's try another one. Yep, got a blood blister here, blood blister here, and we just did another one. Yes, I really gotta be more careful, I tell you what. And as always, broken pintle cap on removal, it happens. If this thing moves whatsoever, it always busts that pintle cap. And another tip here before we remove the rest of them, always go back, check for the lower O-rings. A lot of times they stay in the fuel rail, and you don't want to have those in there when you go to install new ones, or you will have a problem. So let's finish this up. So here's our 4 injectors, and we actually are going to go back here. We're going to kind of clean out these, or the fuel rail where the injectors sit. Just make sure there's no debris in there, so when we do go to lube our injectors and pop them in place, that we don't have any dirt or corrosion getting in the way. So here we've got an OS 380cc purple top kit from Z-Shack, which actually has the billet pintle caps instead of the plastic style that breaks and will fall off over time. These ones will never come off. Cool thing about these, not only does it come with a flowchart sheet for each individual injector, but they're super affordable compared to OEM, and they're super reliable in my experience. I've used them over probably 60,000 miles total in different Zs. Turbo, NA builds, whatever. I love them. They're for a fraction of the cost. You really can't beat it with the OS injections. From Z-Shack, of course. We also got an adapter kit with the caps, new screws, and then we also have little jumper harnesses to put in the OEM spot where you can just plug it in and have extra little harness, or you can just cut this and solder it all in. So everybody's got different ways of doing this. Pretty much you can use just oil, you can use Vaseline, petroleum jelly, whatever. Lube up both of these O-rings on your injector before you install it into the rail. Once you got your O-rings lubed up, we're actually going to grab the adapter kit, which has these lower cups that actually go on the bottom of your injector to make up to this larger size on the early style fuel rail. So you're going to use an O-ring that's originally this same style or size on this, and then you'll use your new style O-ring to pop down inside of this. With it lubed up, twist and push until it gently pushes on. If there's any resistance, get a little bit more lube on it. So now we need to insert our O-ring here on the bottom. And you don't really need to lube this one up. I do just to help it seat, but the way it seats down in here, there's really not much of a way for it to get pinched unless it falls off on the way down. So the oil also helps keep it on. Now we're going to put that O-ring on that adapter, and now we're ready to put it in. So we're going to lube up these O-rings a little bit more, since I have kind of moved them around and touched them, kind of rubbed some of it off. So we're going to push and twist at the same time. Now this can be really tricky, especially on a nice cold day when your seals aren't too pliable. But you want it to pop down kind of into place. An audible pop is best. As you can see here, it's pretty much flush, and that's how you know that it's in place. You always want to check down here as well to make sure your O-ring is not bulging or popping out, so you can tell that it has a correct seal. Because trust me, you don't want to have to do all this again. And I'll open up your cap with your lock washers and your hardware. The top of the injector will sit here in this little beveled edge. And these are tight. You got to kind of put it back here and then drop it down and over. And that is pretty much how you install your injector. I don't generally think it matters. I just snug it with the impact, at least kind of bring it down to where they're both kind of tight. And I kind of always just go to 2 clicks. These things don't need to be crazy tight. Torque spec isn't really that tight. Now, one thing I do really recommend doing is popping your injector back out, making sure your O-ring did not pinch before you put everything back together. Because if you can pop it in once and not pinch it, you can pull it out, lube it back up, pop it in one more time, have some peace of mind knowing that your O-ring's not pinched and you know what's going on inside of this fuel rail. So we're gonna go ahead, do the last 6 or 5, sorry, get this thing all ready to go and then start putting it back in the car. We've now got all of our fuel injectors adapted and seated down into the rail. And we also went ahead and replaced the fuel lines because he actually bought a fuel hose kit so we can replace everything as well as all the spring clamps. So while we're in the midst of doing all this, we actually are ready to put the rail back in the car. What I recommend doing before you do this is to take your lower injector seal or insulator, whatever it is. I actually think these plastics are the insulators, but just take your rail seal, place it on the bottom, so that way it's in place when you go to sit it into the intake. If not, when you go to sit this in, both of these sides are kind of angled, so you can actually pinch and roll over this seal and pretty much cause an air leak, boost leak, etc., etc. So now, got all of our seals on, we can put it back in the car. So I may need to readjust this fuel hose on the front, depending if it was actually the perfect size. I have to say it's pretty close. Just get them seated, kind of push them down into place. And now we can place all 6 of our bolts in, hand thread them tight to get them started, and then tighten them down. I just do hand tight. Torque spec's probably like 5 foot-pounds. Once you got them all tightened down, don't forget to hook up the ground strap to your fuel rail back here on your knock sensor bracket. And now we're down to the last step before we hook everything back up. The last thing what we're going to have to do to make all of this work is we're actually going to have to grind down this little portion right here on the plenum so we can actually get the new style connector onto this injector. It is a taller plug and it's kind of hard to finagle in there, so you got to shave it down. You can get like your drill and like what, maybe $5–7 carbide bits at Harbor Freight. You can actually use the wood ones and they work perfectly fine. These guys right here, I've only used this one right here in the top on the middle. It's done the job for me every time. Wood. So we got rags down here in our intake ports, so we just make sure we get no debris inside of there. And I'll hook this thing up and do a little bit of shredding. It does help to set it in place to kind of mark in between where it needs to be, so you get a good idea. So now we're going to go and start kind of grinding this high spot right in the middle. Like that, you can see the little indent that we did. We're pretty much just shaving it out until we can fit that connector. You do need to come up kind of like a third of this, or maybe about half, and get a good angle so you have room to actually pop it on. And once you get it all grinded out for clearance, you'll be ready to install it. Now, I decided that we're going to go ahead and we're going to do the coolant line bypass here, because when you put this plenum on with all these lines and your EGR, not only is the EGR a pain to get started and then to move everything with everything crammed in position, while also getting your PCV hooked up down here behind your brake master cylinder, We're actually going to remove all of these hard lines right here on the underside of the plenum, and we're going to do a bypass. Basically, we're going to disregard all of these pipes, and we're going to pretty much loop them around up here on the car. So the manual says to do this, there's a little hard line right here for your turbo oil or coolant feed. So we're actually just going to run and replace this hose instead of replacing it down here, because it's OEM, it was done from the factory, so the hose clamp is inwards and it's nearly impossible to get to. So we're going to run this line, replace this, run it back around here and up to this pipe, and then that's the driver's side completely bypassed. As for the passenger side, we have this turbo coolant line down here, which I'm kind of sad that I cut this hose already and put it on. We're actually just going to loop this up right back here, and that is essentially all of your coolant lines bypassed on your plenum that go to the throttle body. Pain in the neck, especially on a stock TT. So what we're going to also have to do is this right here is your EGR vacuum port. We're going to put kind of like an extension there so we don't have to replace the hose back here, because all this is going to come out at one point here in the next year or so. So we're just going to run this over here to the vacuum port. I believe it's this little bracket thing right down here for your EGR, and we're going to replace that line that would have came off and went down there, which I actually believe it's probably this one. So we'll just run a straight 4mm vacuum hose from there. Now there's one more thing you have to do over here on the driver's side. And well, since we're deleting the hard line that feeds this carbon canister line right here, we're actually going to bypass that, and we're going to extend this line, since we're deleting the hard line that goes up into the balance tube. This right here is the port that it hooks up to. So we're going to run our own line all the way and extend it to run down and back. So that's how we're going to get this plenum on much easier, and all of this is going to go together much better. And not to mention, it'll come off much easier. I know you're in the dark. I'll show you the after shot up in the light, but here's a before and after. So we got everything cleaned up here. We went ahead and just put these 10mm bolts back in just because. But we actually left this over here because if you look at it from the side, I guess when you got an EGR, you can't really see it, but just kind of fills that so you don't just see this open nipple. Now over here on this side, since it came straight down and in, we actually just snapped it off somewhere down here, hit it with a hammer back and forth a couple times, and just broke. So we actually left this line on here. I mean, you can remove it, but you need to shim your auxiliary air or fast idle right here. Yeah, it's auxiliary air. You need to shim that out, or use washers to kind of bump that out, or else it'll pull the hoses in. Now, with all of that said, got the bypass done on the car itself. We used some heat shrink or just heat wrap here for where it's by the EGR. We ran it up and back there. We got those spring clamps on both sides. And we also ran this line over here down to the turbo coolant line. And we did manage to get a flathead, just wedge this back, right back here, and we were actually able to pop that EGR vacuum line off, and we got this one here for now until we get everything back together and we can see where to put it. And so we can trim it, you know, accordingly. Only other thing that we have to do is extend this line or get a new line to extend up to the balance tube. Other than that, we're actually ready to put our plenum back on. As long as we ground off enough, which now it's not a big deal. We can kind of test fit it on and off, but when we had those turbo coolant lines and the throttle body coolant lines, I should say, nightmare. There's 10 things you got to get put in place just to be able to sit it down to then start your bolts and get them threaded in. Nah. When you go to sit your plenum on, your main thing is you're going to focus this PCV back here to get it on that elbow, and then both your EGRs to get them centered. Then you can kind of use your bolts to find your threads and drop it down straight. Now just focus on the EGR so we can actually lay the plenum down into place. Because as we have that rear PCV started, it'll actually push itself on as we drop the plenum. Like that. See how easy it just drops down? Now the biggest thing is just keeping that gasket lined up. Oh, I'm so dumb. I didn't put the EGR gaskets on. Now we're going to tighten down all of our plenum bolts in kind of a spiral pattern. and just kind of snug it down before we come back to torque it to 12 foot-pounds. Torque spec is 12 to 15. Since it's aluminum, I always do the low end of the spec to reduce any chance of stripping threads or, you know, breaking a bolt. After I get this on finally, I just realized that unfortunately we're gonna have to shave the plenum even more. If you look down there, we kind of shaved this too far over here, and we actually need to cut back more on this side. Well, it's never easy. Let's fix that up, get the plenum back on, and get it all torqued down. Now that we're torqued down to 12 foot-pounds, we actually did get the EGR in over here on the side, and we replaced these top two 12 mil bolts, as well as the 10 mil that hooks this charge pipe right here to those brackets in the plenum to keep it from moving. We also got the PCV on, like we said we'd do. Now for the driver's side, we got the EGR bolted up here, and we also got that hose clamp down there on that PCV hose. That was a tight fit. If you have a manual car, I honestly have zero idea how you would even get that out without like removing the brake master cylinder. And that just seems like way more than you really should have to do here. Now, what's next? I reckon there's two big things here left to do. Obviously button everything up, but there's one final thing we have to do for this conversion, and that is soldering on new connections onto the wiring harness. That's going to be like the last portion of this video when we do go to throw the wiring harness and then like the balance tube, whatnot on. Also the fuel lines. We're not going to mess with them now, but we will obviously after we get the connection soldered on. So what we can do now is we can actually come over here and we can take our coil packs and we can install them back in the engine. Now this is just to, you know, get rid of some of the stuff we got here sitting on the outside so we can check some stuff off the list. Last but not least, now let's put all of our hardware in and get them all buttoned up. So right after we got all of the coil packs tightened in, we actually fed this charge pipe in kind of like J-ways this way. Once we got it started down there, we twisted it and just brought it back. As we held this in, we guided the back down into the coupler, and then we tightened that 8 mil right back here like this. We did install the 10 mil to help solidify and keep it in place so it will not move whatsoever. Now before we start messing with the wiring harness and doing all the soldering, let's just go ahead and plug in our TPS over here, since realistically we are about done in this area. The last thing, we have this vacuum hose that goes to your carbon canister, goes right up under your throttle body. And this other hose coming up here will actually go to this port on your plenum. And then these two vacuum hoses, we got the shorter one going here to this fitting, which then we have your brake booster hose that goes there, and this will actually go to the hard line on your fuel rail, that in turn goes to your fuel pressure regulator right here. So I did goof up a little over here. When you put those 12 mils on that side bracket, you actually need to put these hard lines on as well. And I'm pretty positive this line over here that is on your accordion pipe goes on the top, and this other one goes here on the bottom. As for the EGR back here, the vacuum line, we actually put it right here on this second one because that's the only hose that actually didn't hook back up to anything. So this hose right here goes down and up here, which goes to your recirc valves. This hooks up to your balance tube, and this hose back here, which is the top of this bracket, also goes to the other port for your balance tube. I will drop a link in the description for the throttle body coolant line bypass and also for vacuum line diagrams. Now we're officially on to the wiring harness. Since we have all of our vacuum lines and stuff hooked up, or at least we went over all of the routing. Honorable mention for the hoses to put your wiring harness to the inside of this idle air control hose. So when you go to put this hose on, it actually wraps and keeps this harness here in place like that. So we just got it on. Oh, we forgot our hose clamp, but yeah, we have this 10 mil to lock it into place. Wiring harness is tucked here nicely. Unplug it, or plug in our coil packs, not unplug them. We'll reconnect this idle air control, fast idle, O2, and your VTC. Make sure this goes into this white wire or connector. A lot of times people will plug this into their knock sensor back here, but your knock sensor is actually on this, where your auxiliary air and your idle or number 6 injector, that's where your knock sensor hooks up. So before we solder, we can actually go ahead and hook this bracket back up over here, because all it does is kind of sit in place on this side. And we've got a 2-wire VTC, which is this white connector. Just plug it back in. And then we have our 3-wire O2 oval connector, which is just like your coil packs here tucked in the back. But it actually never came unplugged, so we're not going to mess with that. We just get to kind of bolt it right back into place. Now, since this is an auto car, we have to hook up our alternator to transmission harness. Got this 10 mil right here on this bracket. That's how you secure this. Now we can actually snake these over here and begin to plug each of them in. Now, let's hope we still have our soldering iron in here somewhere. Oh, there we go. Old reliable, old $5 iron from Harbor Freight. You can tell we've definitely worn that tip out. For this step, you're obviously going to want a soldering iron, some solder, got some paste flux here, and then you want some heat shrink. Obviously, you'll need snips and wire strippers and whatnot so we can actually cut them, pull the sheathing back, and then solder them together. So let's get everything ready, set up here on the stand, and we'll be back. So instead of showing you guys how to solder the connections in car, we're just going to cut this wire, show you guys how to solder so you get a rough general idea of how to do this so you can actually perform it in car. It's going to be way harder for me to, explain this, bending over, reaching like 4 foot, so we're going to do it this way. And we're just going to clip this wire right in half. So when it comes to cutting on your wiring harness for your fuel injectors, you want to cut back far enough that you don't see any green corrosion on the wires. Now we'll strip that wire back roughly 1 inch like that to expose bare wire. And I always like to twist this. So when it comes to this part, I always take it about halfway, maybe a little closer to the base, make an X, and then hook both of them. So you do this right, you won't wrap it up on top of the sheathing itself. So you see we got it like that, twisted. Now we're just going to twist each of these wires around the wire and keep all that extra wire in the center. Now, before you actually twist these together, it's an excellent time to put your shrink wrap on, which obviously I didn't do. So that's one thing I recommend. Always when you cut, put your heat shrink to the farthest end of the wire, because when you solder this wire and you touch it with the iron, it's going to heat up this entire wire. And if that heat shrink is too close to where it's getting the hottest, it's actually going to shrink and you won't be able to get it over your actual connection. So obviously a soldering station is the best to have, which is 2 little clips, kind of like these alligator clips, where you can clip this wire and hold it right here, and then you clip this here so you have a steady, solid connection between the two. Since I don't have all that stuff yet, we're just going to take our iron, and we're actually going to take a little bit of flux. I know this is way too much flux, but the way I look at it, better have more than not enough. Once you get the flux on the wire, we're going to heat the wire up with the iron. We're going to melt that flux onto the wire. Basically what that does is that cleans the wire to allow the solder to stick and adhere to it. When we're ready to solder, pull out some of your spool. Basically you're going to make contact with that wire, get a little bit of solder started on your actual tip so it'll stick to the wire. Once it sticks, you can start feeding your solder into the actual wire itself while you're applying heat with the iron. Just like that, we have soldered our connection together. So now this is when you slide your heat shrink back over, and then you obviously heat shrink it down on there, and then you no longer have an exposed wire. You can either just use a normal lighter or like a torch lighter. Don't put direct flame on your heat shrink, just use the heat to it and shrink wrap that down. So your whole goal is to keep this the size of the wire so that way it doesn't like protrude a whole bunch. But now we have correctly and successfully soldered this wire. In turn, we're going to do the full thing over to the Z. So we'll be back once we're done and we can start putting everything back together. Yay! We've now got all 6 of our fuel injectors soldered on and wrapped up, and are ready to put it all back. We also did our coolant temp sensor while we was here, but this coil pack for your rear cylinder here actually comes back here off of this harness. Don't forget your ground to this 10 mil back here, as well as this ground back here, but you have these two grounds at the harness. Your rear injector comes off the harness back here by your knock sensor and your auxiliary air, and also your other rear injector connector. This one's a one-off, shares the coil pack from back here. And then here you've got these three, and these two are paired, which this is the farthest one, so it's an easy way you can always remember where your connectors go for your wiring harness. And we have the blue and yellow for down here on our idle air control. Now those will only go on certain ones because you can see the tab on the connectors are actually different, so you actually can't mess that up. Now we're going to install the fuel rail since the wiring harness is all finished up. We just kind of lubed up the insides so that way they go on nice and easy, at least they should. I left a couple of them loose just to help get stuff into position first. These are brand new hoses, so they're really tight. And we actually did already mount our fuel pressure regulator to make this all kind of easier to put together. Now we can tuck our harness, start to mount our 10 mils. Sometimes in the midst of putting all this together, it's easy to kind of bend your lines and stuff on accident. So you can always like start your first bolt down here, bend the rest of it to kind of relax it down. And then we'll put the 10 mil up here and also the 10 mil back here and get it all kind of sturdied and straightened out. So let's put all of our hose clamps on, tighten all that up. And then, honestly, we're on to the balance tube. Fuel lines are all done. So we have one vacuum hose to run between here for our fuel pressure regulator, which also bumps up to here, the extra hose we didn't put on the brake booster fitting. Then we'll have one over here that runs to our balance tube. Before we install our balance tube, we're actually going to use a pick and we're going to pull these old O-rings out and we're going to replace them because you really should if they're all flat. And generally about every time that you pull the plenum off, or not the plenum, but the balance tube, good time to do it if you haven't already. So close to being done, I can almost taste it. We got the balance tube, put the idle air control valve portion in first, then tuck your balance tube underneath of your idle air control hard pipe. Get it started, push it down on the studs, and you can put this little bracket here on the passenger side over top, and you can hook up your vacuum lines. And we still got to route that carbon canister line here, back here to the back of our balance tube. We just got to extend it. Little vacuum hose, and also your wastegate hose right here on the balance tube. Two 12 mils with acorn nuts over on the studs. Well, at least this side, you got one over here and two 12 mil bolts. Torque spec, I always do 12 foot-pounds. That's pretty much it. Oh, I guess I forgot one thing. We can put our throttle cable back on. Still got to put the whole cruise unit on, but I'll do that after we put the battery back in. It's only like literally one 10 mil bolt. And this 10 mil over here on the idle air hard pipe shares with this. And then this 10 mil up here on your fuel rail holds the last throttle cable position piece. And then a 14 mil to tighten up your nut. Who am I kidding? How could I forget the throttle cable cover? So that's going to conclude how to do the fuel injectors and the coolant line bypass or delete for your throttle bodies on your Nissan 300ZX twin turbo. So we're inside editing the video and we found out that it's, over 45 minutes long. I guess for all you guys who asked for the long videos, this is for you, but I kind of apologize. But I tried to go over everything that there is to know, or at least notable thing when doing this, and to give you all the confidence that you need to put it back together after taking it apart. Taking it apart is one thing, everyone can do that, but putting it back together, it helps to know where everything goes. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe down below. Stay tuned for more videos, especially if you guys would like to know how to do the 120K timing kit in car on a twin turbo 300ZX, because we actually have that video coming up next. We do have all the final clips edited and filmed now, so we'll be able to get that out ASAP. So again, thank you guys for watching, and until next time, peace.